Good morning and welcome to Global Perspectives. Today we are joined by Dr. Mark Dietz, who is a professor of history at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Dietz is an Africanist specializing in West Africa and has recently written a book, A Country of Defiance, which we'll discuss today. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave.
Mark, before we begin talking about your book and Senegal, tell us how you got interested in this particular region. You are a graduate, first of all, of Annapolis. You are a Marine and a Marine pilot, helicopter pilot. How did you end up in academia as a African specialist?
That's a great question. So there's a program in the military for military officers called the Foreign Area Officer Program. And in this program, the military sends you to get a master's degree in a particular kind of area studies focus. And so my focus was sub-Saharan Africa. And I got to do that program and go to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And then because I got this assignment to go be the defense attaché to Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, the Cape Verde Islands. But I was going to be living in Dakar. I was sent to the Defense Language Institute to learn French. So I got the opportunity to study French for about 6 months before heading to Dakar and starting the job.
Did you always have an interest in Africa, or is this just emerged to you? Obviously, it's quite different than flying helicopters.
It was not something that I had always been interested in, but I became interested in it, and I was interested in an assignment that would allow me to live overseas with my family, and I thought that would be a valuable experience. I also wanted to learn a foreign language, and so, I took Spanish in high school, but I was never really fluent in that, and so this program that would give me the opportunity to become fluent in a language was very attractive to me. And, when I also discovered that almost half of the African continent speaks French in one way or another, that also made that very intriguing to me. And so, I applied for the program and got accepted to study sub-Saharan Africa for subsequent assignment, either with a staff or in an embassy in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I got to do that in Senegal.
You've written a lot on society and culture, above and before politics. How does the colonial history affect this region to this day in society, culture, and of course in politics?
Well, I would argue that it's one of the most fundamental legacies in the region. And I think all you have to do, in fact, this was actually kind of one of the things that triggered my interest in the Casamance conflict, was the geography of Senegal and the Gambia. So if you take a look at the map of West Africa, the westernmost tip of Africa is Senegal, and it's right where Dakar is, which is the capital of Senegal. The country of Senegal kind of makes this backward C shape. And then the Gambia, which was colonized by the British, is like right in the middle of that. So it's sort of this lock and key kind of geography. And this is actually a part of the some of the kind of origins of the conflict, is what I argue in the book. Because you had Senegal, which was colonized by the French, and then you had the Gambia, which was in the very middle of the country, which was colonized by the British. And then to the south, you had, at that time, Portuguese Guinea, which then becomes Guinea-Bissau, obviously colonized by the Portuguese. All of this sort of colonial mapping is a part of what brings about the Casamance conflict. And that's a part of the argument in my book. And it's really interesting to look at the sort of the colonial horse trading that was kind of taking place in the late 1800s, because at one point, the French had gone to the British and said, hey, this doesn't make any sense for you to have a colony in the middle of ours. So why don't we trade you the Gambia for Cote d'Ivoire and Gabon? the British turned them down because at that time, trade along the Gambia River was so valuable to the British. And of course, they had no foresight to see what, the oil and the sort of rubber and other kinds of resources that could be found in Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire. And so the Gambia remained a British colony, remained an English-speaking colony. And so that was one of the original things that really attracted my attention. And it's a result of the colonial legacy in this part of West Africa. And just to add to that colonial legacy a little bit, the name Casamance actually came from the Portuguese, who were some of the original Europeans to start showing up on this part of the West African coast in the 15th century. This region was known as Casa, and it had in an earlier era been touched by the ancient or medieval Mali Empire, so it was kind of Mandinka, and the Mande word for king was Mansa, and so they referred to the Mansa of Casa, or the king of Casa, in their reporting from kind of that earliest exploration and sort of colonial beginnings in West Africa from the Portuguese.
Let me ask you, in writing this book, I mean, a lot of our viewers have not heard of this conflict. So did you write this book in part to raise awareness of it, or to explore it in depth, or a little of both?
Yes, a little of both. So it is a very lesser known conflict, and I think that's partly because of the relatively low casualty figures that we have from this conflict. First of all, Senegal is one of the few sub-Saharan African countries that's never had a coup d'etat. And so Senegal takes a lot of pride in that. However, they've had this separatist conflict going on. The earliest violence began in December of 1982. So I did write the book partly to raise awareness. It's a story that deserves to be told. It's been a little over 5,000 casualties, or 5,000 people who've been killed in the conflict since it first began in December 1982. And so in terms of West African conflicts, that's a relatively low number of casualties. When you're talking about Liberia with hundreds of thousands of people killed in the Liberian Civil War, or you're talking about Sierra Leone with about 70,000 people killed in that civil war, this is a very low intensity conflict. And yet, obviously, to the families of the 5,000 people who've been killed, it matters a lot. It also matters a lot because of the sort of limited opportunities for development because of this, and also because of the use of landmines by both sides in this conflict, which then takes out of commission some of the agricultural lands. The Jola people and the Mandinka, to some extent, in this southern part of Senegal, are known for their rice agriculture. And so, all of these minefields have taken out some of that land from production. And so, just in terms of development, it's really been a big problem. One of the things that the U.S. government was working on when I was there was a humanitarian demining project to help take out some of those landmines. But nevertheless, in spite of a ceasefire that was signed in December of 2004, a peace accord. There have been several ceasefires that were signed and then broken, but there was a peace accord signed in December of 2004. There's been this sort of continuing nagging conflict that today people refer to it as neither war nor peace, that just kind of keeps nagging and limiting the opportunities for development in the region.
Mark, can you briefly summarize the nature of the conflict, why this is going on, what are the central grievances?
Sure. So the primary grievance for the separatists, this is a separatist conflict. So the separatist group, and I'm not going to say the Casamance, because the separatist group does not represent all Casamance. It does not represent all of the people in southern Senegal. But the separatist group wants to have their own independent slice of Senegal. In fact, they don't want to be a part of Senegal anymore. And they say that it's because of the ways in which the Senegalese were basically an occupying force that replaced the French as the colonizers in the region. So they basically consider, again, the separatists do, not everybody in Casamance. The separatists consider independent Senegal to be just another sort of colonizing power that is practicing power illegitimately because it doesn't understand the people and it looks down on the people of the Casamance. And so, I mentioned the importance of rice agriculture before. There are these sort of stereotypes, right, of people from northern Senegal being merchants and being involved in commerce historically and coming to the Casamance to basically take advantage of the people there and take advantage of these agriculturalists, these peasants. There was the development of a tourism sector after World War II, kind of in the 60s and the 70s after Senegal got its independence in 1960. And a lot of the people who were kind of running these tourist hotels and involved in the tourist industry, partly because of their experience with France in northern Senegal, were these people coming from northern Senegal. And so many of them were Wolof in terms of their ethnic group. Others were Tukulur or Mandinka. They were kind of viewed as these invaders, if you will. And this movement, this idea for separatism really gets going in the late 1970s, following kind of the worldwide economic crisis, the oil crisis, the coming of structural adjustment programs in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the third world, led to this kind of this sense of crisis in the late 1970s. And so that's really when the separatist movement began to gain momentum. And it named itself after an earlier version of the Movement of Democratic Forces of the Casamance, the MFDC, which is the French acronym. They named themselves after this party that was in existence from 1949 to 1954. So, but it was a regional party from this southern part of the country, and they kind of resurrected that and called themselves the MFDC, and then eventually began to engage in violence with Senegalese gendarmes and Senegalese armed forces after 1982.
Mark, you write a lot about mapping identity. And identity, of course, is a very strong element. And a lot of these countries, you're describing the region itself, they're not natural boundaries. These are countries largely written in terms of a map by colonial map makers, not by necessarily tribes that work together or are naturally allied. But they've been put in these countries that come up with names, whether they're Senegal or Zimbabwe or wherever in Africa. This is frequent.
Right.
And the attempt, of course, is made to create a national identity out of something that is not necessarily historically based. How successful has it been in Senegal compared to other African nations, creating an identity?
I would say it's been very successful, especially in comparison to other African nations. You're absolutely right that this is one of the primary challenges for post-colonial African states. Is to build a nation and to build a national identity. And in many cases, as you mentioned, you're bringing together a number of ethnic groups who had not been together before. In other cases, you had colonial borders that divided ethnic groups that had been together before. And so now they're actually divided. In fact, we could talk about the Jola and the Mandinka and the Fulani in West Africa being groups like this that are divided by a number of different states. This is actually a part of one of the claims of the separatist group, which is that they were representing this kind of Jola Republic, which is that ethnic group that's kind of at the center of this rebellion. Not everybody in the MFDC is Jola, but a lot of them are, and this has been viewed as kind of a Jola rebellion. And so you have all of these different groups. The Jola talk about the kind of the old Jola Republic. The separatist leader, who was a Catholic priest by the name of Augustin, I think in America we would say Augustin Jomakun Senghor, he referred to the three Bs of the Jola Republic, which were Banjul in the Gambia, Bissau and Guinea-Bissau, and then Bignona, which is a regional town in the Casamance part of Senegal. And so you have these legacies of the pre-colonial history that's still there, and you have these challenges for these nationalist leaders who are trying to kind of pilot the ship of state here in the late colonial period, which is basically from really kind of the 1950s and 1960s in sub-Saharan Africa, that they're trying to navigate the ship of state into independence with peace and sovereignty. And you can see why this is a real challenge. One of a famous historian of Africa referred to this as the bundling of ethnicities, trying to bundle these ethnicities together and to get them to stop thinking of themselves in terms of only the ethnic group and to think of themselves as Senegalese. Now, one of the challenges, if I could go on, sure. one of the challenges in the Casamance is that Senegal has been founded on what one scholar, Mamadou Diouf, refers to as calling it kind of the Islamo-Wolof model, or in other words, kind of the Islamo-Wolof national identity of Senegal, which suggests that in order to be Senegalese, you're, for one thing, Muslim, and if you're not Wolof, by the way, it's only 35% of the population, maybe 40% that's actually Wolof, but everybody else speaks Wolof because it's the lingua franca. If you're not speaking French, which is the official language, the language of of educated people, then most people are speaking Wolof. So that seemed exclusionary to people from the Casamance, who, first of all, were not Wolof, and they viewed the Wolof as invaders, as I mentioned earlier. Second of all, the Casamance was one part of Senegal, which is 95% Muslim, where Catholic missionaries achieved some success in conversions. And so actually in the other area is north of the Casamance and north of the Gambia, where the country's first president, Leopold Senghor, was from. This is one of the areas that is Catholic, it's Christian. However, it's still majority Muslim. It's probably about somewhere between 65 to 75% majority Muslim, even though it's the one part where Catholicism achieved some success in conversions, mostly in the late 19th century to early 20th century. Yeah. So you can see we have ethnicity, we have religion, we have nationalism, and all of these things that are kind of going into this brew or this soup that create these different identities and this sense for Casamance that they are different from people from northern Senegal and that they don't want to be a part of Senegal because of this.
Are there aspirations for separatist state independence, if you will? Are they actually probable, likely, or is this more an aspirational type of goal?
It's aspirational. We, we haven't really seen, I don't think, any kind of detailed planning or sort of strategy document for a kind of day after, if you will, of the Casimols conflict. Of what if the Casimols actually got its independence, which comparing the combat power of the Senegalese armed forces, which is a modern professional army, against the MFDC is a kind of a story of David and Goliath. And so it kind of looks, from an outside perspective, it looks very unlikely that the Casimols would ever win its independence against the will of the Senegalese. And so, yeah, it's doubtful that that would happen. There hasn't been much. There's been some writing by a few Casamance intellectuals of what that could look like, but other people have talked about some degree of autonomy short of independence. But all of these are rather elementary. None of them have been really fleshed out in much detail to this point.
Is there an international role in making sure that this doesn't become a conflict that goes from 5,000 casualties over 40 years to 5,000 in a month? I mean, these things can happen relatively quickly, but of course there's issues of sovereignty, but also, is the international community paying attention? Should it be?
Yes, yes, the international community has been paying attention, at least in the region. It's not something that most of us in America would see, but the international community has definitely been involved in trying to help the Senegalese government and the MFDC implement the peace deal from 2004. This peace deal was signed a month before I arrived in the country as one of the American military attaches in January of 2005. And so, yes, the international community has been very involved in trying to help kind of broker this peace, and a couple of different nations have kind of taken the lead at different times in trying to lead this. Of course, as the former colonial power, at one time it was France, and that was kind of in the mid to late 90s. And then in the early to mid 2000s, which kind of when I was there, the United States was kind of playing that role and trying to help broker a lasting peace. There was hope that this had been achieved by 2004. Again, with that peace deal in December of 2004, but the violence returned in March of 2006. So it was about the time actually of the conflict in Lebanon with Israel and all of that kind of stuff. At about the same time that really most of the international community's focus was on that, the Casamance conflict kind of rekindled and kind of restarted, in spite of what was supposed to be, what was hoped for, a permanent peace accord.
Are there outside actors who are inflaming this situation? Or is this entirely internal?
So there are outside actors. The neighboring countries of the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau have not always helped. Some of the political turbulence from the last president of the Gambia, Yahya Jammeh, who was replaced as president in 2016, and he was Jola himself. He was from that ethnic group that's at the heart of the rebellion, and so he kind of liked to meddle in this to kind of it seemed like to kind of poke the bear a little bit with Senegal occasionally. But for the most part, I think he found it more in his interest to not go too deep into meddling in the Casamance, even though he comes from a village which is right across the border from the Casamance. The other neighbor to the south, Guinea-Bissau, has seen quite a bit of combat just across the border. You have to understand that when this conflict first began, the MFDC, they were equipped, they were armed with bows and arrows and spears and machetes. That was about it. And so over the course of time, they were able to, especially in the post-Cold War era, as former Soviet and former American weapons began to flood into the continent to some extent, but mostly former Soviet weapons. They began to obtain AK-47s. They began to obtain landmines that I mentioned. They came to obtain rocket-propelled grenades and things like this. To some extent, I think they may have had a mortar capability at some point, but all of this is no match whatsoever for the combat power of the Senegalese Armed Forces, which has modern combat aircraft. They have heavy artillery. They have mortars that, and M16s. I mean, they receive American and French military training and all of these kinds of things. So it was not a fair fight, but one of the advantages that a guerrilla force often enjoys is knowledge of the terrain, right? And so they would go across the border into the Gambia to the north, or across the border into Guinea-Bissau in the south, and kind of hide. That's where they would hide their weapons. They had weapons caches in these neighboring countries. And then when they were ready, they would come across the border, punch the Senegalese armed forces in the nose, and then flee back across the border as soon as they could. Because the Senegalese is Senegal is a modern nation state, and they respect those international borders. So they eventually that respect for sovereignty kind of begins to degrade a little bit, especially with Guinea-Bissau, where they're chasing rebels into Guinea-Bissau. But they had to be careful about that, and they knew that, and that did limit them somewhat. I think those are the main countries, kind of those neighboring countries that have also played a role in the conflict, besides kind of the great powers like America and France.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. We're unfortunately out of time already, but congratulations on the book, and we hope to have you back to talk about some of the issues facing this region particularly, but Africa generally.
My pleasure, David. Thank you very much.
Take care. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Global Perspectives.